Now I have the pleasure of introducing our panel. And here they are. First of all, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the panel Rachel Simnett. Rachel is a senior research consultant and an expert in finding out what people want from digital products. She's got over 15 years experience in user research and testing. She started at the BBC and since then has worked on learning projects with organisations including BP, Jaguar Land Rover, you name it. Welcome back, Rachel.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here again.
Thank you. And then I'd also like to welcome back John Casey. John's got more than 20 years experience implementing EdTech solutions across a range of education establishments. Currently working at City College Glasgow as a senior learning technologist, one of his many responsibilities is a UFI project on citizen literacy. There's not much John doesn't know about how to combine the technical, educational and human elements of an EdTech project. Welcome back, John.
Thanks a lot.
Great. And finally, I'm very pleased to introduce the amazing Rachel Smith. Rachel cut her digital teeth as a solutions architect and senior developer. Since then, she's gone on to be a web services manager, a digital experience consultant, and currently heads up a team of UX designers. Rachel specializes in using evidence to making digital design better, and that involves testing in all its forms. Thanks for being with us, Rachel.
Great to be here. Thanks a lot, Sarah.
Not at all. It's great to have you here. So now our questions. This challenge is all about helping some of the people who are least likely to engage with learning. And that'll involve working closely with the learners to ensure that any solution works effectively for that group. And that means testing. Looking at project plans, well, the ones submitted to UFI, testing sometimes seems to be just put in as an afterthought. It's a kind of tick in the box to confirm that your ideas are exactly right. Can you tell us about a time when testing with your learners completely turned around a project's approach? Rachel Simnett, could you start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got two examples, so I'll try to rattle through them quite quickly. I think the first one was I was involved in the design of an induction program, an online learning experience at a multinational energy company. And you can imagine for something like that, every department expected a page about them within this learning course. And HR and various business services were particularly insistent that there were pages of information on values and performance management and appraisals and health and safety and risk management and on and on and on. One of the content ideas within this induction course was to include a checklist of what to do on your first day, on your first week, your first month and your first 3 months. And when we tested the course, which luckily we had provided enough time for, the majority of learners were really only interested in the checklist. They rated it as the most useful element. And in their free exploration of the induction course, very few people went anywhere near what I would call the corporate information pages. However, these pages had really important information on them. So what we realised we had to do was we had to embed the learning from those other areas, such as safety and compliance, into the checklist. So the checklist was the way in. And it was the way that the material could then make contextual sense to the learners. And it was a way to get people into those sections of the site that had a bit of a barrier to them. So the testing was really, really important to actually reveal what learners would find the most useful. And it led us to much more tightly embed all the learning content into that tool and linking out from that tool. I just want to very quickly give a second example, which is a very cautionary tale. I was testing a really clever, smart app for line managers to gather 360 feedback from their teams. And they had this feedback function. It was very sophisticated. It relied on integration with the email system. And the product had been tested in the UK and some surveys had been run with the end audience. And a large percentage of people had said that they were using the feedback function and they were rating it very high, 4 out of 5. However, I said, we need to speak to some people about this to discover how they're using it. And when we spoke to them, we found that very few were using the feedback function. They were using resources within the app to help them with their feedback skills. And in fact, there were many technical bugs that had prevented the feedback function from working, particularly in overseas territories. And English was not many people's first language either. So there was a big gap between what the survey did showed us and what we actually found out when we spoke to people on the ground. And when people realised how this app was supposed to work, they were really not at all happy. So you will often get high ratings in surveys, in my experience, than when you actually speak to people. So I think that those need quite a lot of careful use. Always back up a survey, a questionnaire, by speaking to people directly and digging into how they actually use the learning resource.
Thanks, Rachel. That's really, really interesting. I'm going to come to John now, and just a bit of housekeeping. If you're not talking, could you in the panel keep your sound turned off, because we've got a bit of interference from somewhere. So thanks, Rachel. Really great. John, do you want to tell us about a time when testing completely changed your approach to the project?
Yeah, I've got two examples as well. I'll try and keep them brief. First was in a large dispersed higher education institution. I won't use names because the outcomes were a bit suboptimal, shall we say, to be diplomatic. And they were creating their own virtual learning environment. And you might well think, why on earth would you do that? And it went on for several years, actually. And there was testing. But the moral of this story is they did not listen to the results of the testing. And this is not uncommon in organizations. The result of this, eventually, it hit a brick wall where it just couldn't go on any longer. And that organization brought in a commercial virtual learning environment, which wasn't ideal, but did work and enabled it to do what it needed to do. So I guess the moral of that story is listen to the results of testing, make sure that they're recorded and actioned upon. The second example is testing the wrong things. This was a very large national project I was involved in. This is back in the days when learning objects were very fashionable in EdTech. And at that time, there was a concentration on something called metadata, what I used to call catalog information or information about information. And the favorite way of defining it was metadata would be what's on the outside of a tin of soup. It tells you what's on the inside. That's what learning object metadata was. And at that time, this project was concentrating almost exclusively on these technical issues. And because it was being managed by information specialists, you can understand that. So the users were presented with some incredible number of metadata fields, potentially about 50, something like that. But they were looking at information, but they weren't looking at the user experience at all, I'm afraid. And I was working with a bunch of software engineers that were working with the company that was supplying the platform. And the software engineers were working in the university. The company was a company. And the software engineers I was working with were pulling their hair out because they were telling me, this platform just doesn't work. Really doesn't work. With more than 2 people on it, it collapses. And I said, this can't be right, surely. But sure enough, it was true. So the complete turnaround of this was this national service launched not with the original platform. The software engineers were plunged into redeveloping another open source platform, DSpace from MIT, at very short notice to enable that service to run. Again, the moral of the story is test the right things and make sure you action the tests. We had to tell the national service that this would damage their reputation if they actually launched this platform. And that seemed to get through to them finally. So there's an issue here of the results of testing and what you test. It's also related to issues of power relationships. Something to remember. That's my examples.
Oh, thanks, John. That's a really, very useful ideas. We're going to come and talk a bit later about all the different types of testing and how you plan for that. So Rachel Smith, last but not least.
Hi everyone. So I don't have any specific examples of where I've been working with learners themselves, but I think in general I can talk in general about some of the project problems that I've had over the last few years. I can give one example where we were building a site for somebody, and very enthusiastic team, really wanted to get in there, wanted to build it as fast as possible. There were business drivers to get things up and running as soon as possible. We didn't have time to do any of the usual research that we would do at the beginning of any project that we undertook. And we just built this site, and unsurprisingly, it wasn't like the if you build it, they will come. Nobody came to our website. Nobody came and used our facilities. Nobody used the application form that we were trying to build for them. So then everybody thought, oh, what a great idea. Let's do some user testing now at the end of the project, after we've built it all, and see what the problem is, because it might just need a little tweak. Actually, what the research actually showed us was that we'd got the whole kind of user journey completely. It was wrong. The foundations weren't there at the beginning to actually know who our users were, know what they wanted to do when they came to the site, and therefore it was doomed to failure because we hadn't done the groundwork that we needed to do. The user testing showed that very clearly, and unsurprisingly, that project has been pulled now, and we have to kind of go back and try and recreate something with a better foundation. So that's my advice to you: do your groundwork at the beginning.
Thanks, Rachel. That's great. There is a real moral here, isn't it, about not waiting till the end to do your testing. So I want to just kind of maybe you can lead off on our second question, because there are all sorts of different sorts of testing, aren't there? There's user testing, there's technical testing, usability testing, and user testing is a really broad term. And what sort of activities are involved, and how do you plan for them? Obviously, you do plan for them, and you don't wait right till the end.
Yes, as a number of our examples showed, it's not a great idea to kind of just leave everything to the last minute in terms of actually understanding your users, understanding their needs. In answer to your question about what is user testing, well, I actually tend to prefer the term user research because testing has a bit of a negative connotation. And if you kind of ask somebody to come and take part in some user research, they're more likely to do it. If you say, I want to test you, they're not going to be up for it. So in terms of the kinds of things that you can do in user research, I think Rachel mentioned surveys. Surveys are a good way to start understanding your user needs. Start doing those at the beginning. But as Rachel also said, it's a great idea to do some follow-up interviews as well with people, because I find, and I'm sure the rest of the panel will agree with me, that people tend to answer, questionnaires really quickly. They're great for a temperature check, but they're not very good for giving you the qualitative data that you really need to really understand what your user audience, their needs and their pain points are. Another great one, and really cheap and easy, is observing people. Observing people using maybe maybe they're doing something in a factory or something like that. You could observe them, ask them what their training needs are. Where do you have problems? What do you have to refer to the manual for? Asking people and observing people while they're actually doing something is a great way to understand more about what people are doing. And you could call that's user research as well. I really like in-depth interviews with people, but the thing I would recommend to people is having a proper script. Have a very clear script that you can guide people through. There's a number of reasons. It keeps things consistent, and it also allows you to, if you get distracted, you can always come back and use the script again. I would, in terms of user testing, we've already mentioned regular intervals. Always test at regular intervals. And even if you don't know what you're going to test in session 5, just have that booked in already and know that you've got that time to actually talk to the users of the products that you're building. Another tip around that is also kind of tailoring your research. So at the beginning, you can start off really conceptual, and then you can move into kind of hypothesis testing, like really understanding what the problems are that you've identified in the first stage. And then the last stage is much more about validation. You can really observe people and be much more task focused. So start with a big funnel at the beginning and kind of tailor it with your project plan to be much more honed down towards the end. Another thing to look up, go and have a look at guerrilla testing. I love the name, but go out there, try testing it on people who are in the office or not in the office. Just try and test it with anyone. Test it with your neighbour. I don't know if you haven't got access to people. Just try and do some of that little bits of testing. It can be very worthwhile throughout. It's still user testing. It might not be your end learners, but somebody might give you some insights there that could be very useful.
That's brilliant. That's absolutely. I love the idea of guerrilla testing. Yeah. John, do you want to? John, do you want to come in? And you got any comments on what Rachel's just said?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to take it a slightly different way. I'm thinking of, see, the problem of reaching your learners and customers from a testing point of view is made up of interconnected systems. So there's people, things, organizations, and technologies. And if your testing activities are testing in and between these systems, that'll do you a lot of good. If you test things, just one or two things in isolation, you're in danger of missing something critical. So I would advise creating a checklist of the different systems involved at the start of your project and to keep them up to date. So I made up these categories off the top of my head earlier today, but people, things, organizations, and technologies is not a bad start. Who are the end people that are going to use your product or system, and who are the people who might enable that to reach users? So you start to build up this richer picture of, if you like, what you have to do to get to your learners. It's a common thing to miss, that you miss the systems aspect of a project, and that the thing that you overlook is often the thing that will let you down. So creating a simple checklist, I think in fancy speak, it might be called a situation analysis or something like that. But just under those categories, what would those things be that you would need to look at, that would need to all work together? It's rare in my experience that an ed tech solution magically finds someone on its own. It's usually someone else has got to facilitate it reaching the end learner. So yeah, I take a systems approach. I think that's the biggest tip I could give.
Rachel Simnett, you were nodding during a lot of that. Did you want to comment on either the other Rachel or John's approach?
Yes, thank you. Yes, a lot of what Rachel said really chimed with me. The point about observations, because I've been doing testing now for quite a long time, and it really has developed, I think, on from us being very focused on what we heard people saying to doing more and more observation-based testing. So quite often now, if I am in a lab kind of situation, or even if I'm sitting at somebody's desk, I do have a script, but usually there's a fair proportion of the session I just sit back and let them get on with using whatever it is quite freely without prompting an interruption, and then following up later on with your own prompts to dig into certain actions that they did. Because what I think we've learned over the years is that sometimes when people say things, that it doesn't always chime with what they're doing. And it's what they're doing that really matters. So that's what I would say. I think walking around the shop floor, as I would call it, yeah, absolutely. I remember doing that at a motor manufacturer. I think you mentioned actually JLR at the beginning, and watching some of the apprentices working, and that was really, really interesting actually to just to watch them and see how they were interacting with their supervisors or people kind of helping them out and teaching them and stuff. And guerrilla testing, I think, has become increasingly popular because it's cheaper. So I've a few of the things that I've done. I mean, you know, going into staff canteens and literally pouncing on people, or having a desk set up somewhere in a public area, which a lot of people are passing, maybe outside the canteen or the cafe, and then inviting people to come just for a few minutes and sit with you and have a look at something or have a chat. Or gate crashing events is another thing I've done. So there's a marketing event, and they're going to, you know, over a lunchtime, and we kind of crash it, come in and just have a little area and just try to catch people there. So I think all of those things are really, really useful techniques.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Yeah, I want to come on to testing learning design now, because I see that as being having particular challenges. I mean, the learners, the challenge, this particular UFI challenge, which is the target, are amongst those furthest from learning, and we want to encourage them to learn vocational skills and increase their confidence. But how do you test whether the learning design works for them? So, John, do you want to talk to us about how you go about testing for the effectiveness of learning design?
Mute myself first. Yeah, well, following from what we were saying about user testing, direct access to your learners is what you need ideally. I'll talk a little bit about if you can't have direct access to your learners. And that's really important. You need to understand the situation that they're in. And again, that systems approach, all the different things that affect their approach to learning, both their personal experience, but also where they're situated. Is it a noisy place? Is it late at night? And if these people are going to be learning autonomously, it's presumably going to be fitted in around the rest of their life. I think in our last session, we talked a little bit about developing user personas and things like that, user profiles, and that can be useful, but there is a danger of it becoming a stereotype. But having such a set of ideas about who your learners are is obviously really valuable. And the closer you can get to your learners as well is really important. Another thing that I just thought of, which is kind of obvious, but is surprisingly absent sometimes, even or especially in academia, where I've worked sometimes, is that you need to have learning outcomes clearly defined and criteria for being able to assess those learning outcomes and methods to assess those learning outcomes and instruments and tools to assess those learning outcomes. And having that is actually a really, really important aspect of your learning design. That is, if you like, the foundation. I'm not on a commission or anything, but I found the work of Jenny Moon really excellent in that area. She's got a book called, I think, Module Workbook or something. But anyway, it's those things: assessment, learning outcomes, assessment criteria, methods, and ways of doing it. That's, if you like, the bedrock of it. So if you can't access your learners for all kinds of reasons, you're going to need to use some kind of intermediary. Maybe you already know a lot about your learners, but you might well need to use people who are close to your learners. And that might be a place in a factory, a trade union learning rep, a friend, a relative, a tutor, community worker, and so on. And these intermediaries will know how to gather information about your learners, and there will be a slight there might be a training element. And the best thing we found in a project we were doing about adult literacy, we were using intermediaries to observe, and that they had questions, a questionnaire to ask, but it was we weren't asking our learners to write anything down. Our intermediaries were going to, a structured interview can help a lot with this kind of stuff. Now, the other thing about figuring out if your learning design works, well, your learning design will be part of a bigger product that you want to get something done. Recently, we did a project for Nesta about adult literacy, and they came up with something called a theory of change model that I had never heard of before. And before I forget, it was really useful, but I'm just going to pop some links into the chat for you so you can follow it up if you like. And the learning, the theory of change is basically where you want to get to with your learning design and work backwards, what needs to happen to be in place to get there. And then it starts getting iterative, you go round and round. And we found that really quite useful, because that theory of change, in this case about people gathering confidence, motivation, is bigger than just a very narrow learning design. It's about an emotional attitude, if you like. So this theory of change is a good vehicle for capturing all those elements that are involved. And I know the UFI are using the theory of change as well.
We do indeed, and Hillary's just put a link in the chat. We're a big fan of the theory of change. Know where we want to get to, and then try to build the in-between steps between where you are now and how you do that.
Yeah, so what I've put in the link there is some links to some free toolkits from the Learning and Work Institute and from Nesta as well, that participants in this might find useful if you've not come across the theory of change stuff before. I've also put a Wikipedia link in there as well, which I always rely on for like the basics. And if I knew how to share my screen, I would share our theory of change.
That's okay, John. I mean, I think I'm going to come back. I'm going to move on to Rachel Simnett, because I'm quite interested to hear what Rachel thinks about testing for learning design effectiveness, or testing for learning design.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, a lot of what resonated again there. I'm particularly where you can test in situ, and also having clearly defined outcomes. It's amazing sometimes that these don't seem to exist. When you come to a project, you say, well, what are the learning outcomes? And people look a bit blank at you. So, well, we need to teach people this, and this. And I said, for what end? And they can't always answer that, so it's so crucial. But what I was going to talk about for a couple of minutes, I guess, is to some extent, when you're testing whether a learning design works for somebody or not, some of this is, you can take the long view, because there's only so much you can do during and immediately after the learning experience, because we all know learning evaluation has to happen over time, as well as having some immediate feedback. So I would say when you're doing a test, I mean, hopefully the learning that you're testing, the course, the modules that you're testing have been designed in such a way that it will be quite clear to you, observing the person going through it, whether the design is working at the time, either on a comprehension level, as an experience, as a user experience, in terms of the level it's been pitched at, in terms of resonance, how real does it feel, and of course in terms of usability and functionality. When I test learning experiences, what I tend to do is start off with a few questions to gauge the person's level of interest and level of confidence. And then I sit back and invite them to work through it with little intervention or questioning. And I just note down what they're doing, how they're answering, and then we review it. And I use that opportunity to probe on understanding and learning at the time. And then at the end, we'll finish off with some experience questions around relevance, length, clarity, interface design, and so on. But that doesn't hit the longer term evaluation question. I'd be really interested to hear what other people on the panel think about this. I'm a tad cynical about longer term learning evaluation, because I personally don't think it's been cracked really very successfully. I think the problem is organisations are often not that interested. They just forget about it. But I was thinking about this earlier, and I was reminded of that really famous quote from an American pioneer of department stores in the 19th century, when he was talking about his advertising budget. And he said, half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. And I think that sometimes that's a kind of the case with learning to some extent. You know, some of it's hitting the mark, but you can't always actually really be confident exactly where it is. I mean, obviously there are ways of evaluating whether vocational skills have been learnt or not. I think keeping in touch with line managers, trying to set up some continuous feedback loops and improvement mechanisms. And I guess my final point I would like to make is that in terms of measuring people's confidence, of course, you can ask people how about their confidence before, during, after sessions, a few weeks' time, but that's always going to be subjective. So you do always need other measures to look for something to back up those subjective viewpoints.
Great, thanks so much, Rachel. I've got a specific question on confidence, but it's a one after the next one, because the next one that I really want to, and in fact it's going to be to you, which is that we've had a lot of talk about different sorts of testing and different methods, but how do all these different types of testing relate to each other? Whether you're doing user testing, whether you're doing technical testing, they're all different sorts of. But where do you start? How do you plan for these different types of testing? I'm going
to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Yep. I'm just hoping you can see that. This is a very traditional design and build process little diagram I've got here, like a cycle for the development of any product or service. But I thought it would be useful to use this to illustrate how the different testing stages fit together. And it is quite old-fashioned, and we'll talk about the more modern approach maybe at the end. So learner-centered design. So at each stage of a development, whether it's the definition, the design, the build, or the evaluation, you're putting the learner right in the middle, and you're constantly checking in with them that what you're doing is going to meet their needs. That's how I see learner-centered design. And I think in terms of testing, what I've done is, I don't know how well you can see this, but I've just popped some orange labels on this diagram to show the different types of, well, it's research, as Rachel was rightly saying. We should talk about research, not testing. The different types of research that you might do at different stages. And so I find this, you don't need to do them all, but if you have a map, something like this, and then you can look at your project plan and you can work out what have you got time and budget for, where do you really need to focus, what would be the most valuable. So in the definition stage, of course, you need to understand people's needs, people's learning needs, and of course the organizational needs. We've mentioned user profiling. So long as that doesn't fall into stereotypes, that's a very useful thing to do as well. And I would also add data analytics to that. It's always good to have some quant to have a look at if it's in a particular area that you're a problem that you're trying to solve. Why are there hundreds of calls to the IT help desk immediately after the Christmas holidays, for example? And then in the design phase, if you had time and budget, typically you might do concept testing, you might do prototyping, and then during the build stage, pilot maybe just one module out of however many you're developing. Most of the testing probably, or the research, tends to come towards the end with user testing, which Rachel's talked through the many approaches to that, and technical testing, or UAT as it used to be called. And of course, there may well be assessments within the material themselves that you can look at. And then in terms of evaluation, which I've mentioned already, I personally think is a little tricky on the longer term, but of course you can get immediate user feedback. It's always good to set up feedback mechanisms. Looking at the learning effectiveness, quite hard to measure, but you can do follow-ups, for example, like maybe quick quizzes for people a few months down the line to see how much is stuck. You can talk to people's line managers and find out how well they're doing, if you've got the time to do that. And then there's the organizational impact. So again, if you've got those clear objectives and outcomes, what is it you wanted to achieve? Did you want to reduce the number of accidents? Did you want to reduce the number of calls to the help desk? Has that happened? To be able to measure that over time. And then all of that learning hopefully then feeds into the development of your next learning course. So I hope that's useful. That's just a little diagram. That's quite an old-fashioned process. And so I guess in recent years, with the development of agile methodologies, we've moved to a slightly more iterative model where the design and build processes have kind of got merged together. So some people work in, say, 2 to 4 week sprints, and they do rapid testing over a series of sprints, maybe between 2 and 4 weeks, and so that they're iterating the design as they go. Now, for me personally, I'm not sure how well this always works for learning courses. It works great for software and maybe other kind of digital services. Learning, I'm not completely convinced on, but I think it's like a good principle to have in your head in terms of this constant checking back with learners as often as you can to ensure that what you are building is what they need. Okay, so I'm going to just stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you. That was really, really useful. And if you're okay with it, we'll okay if we share those 2 slides with the people who are listening. So I want to come to first John and then Rachel Smith. See whether you've got any comments on Rachel Simnett's view on how you integrate different sorts of testing.
Yeah, I think that's still really good points. And again, it comes back to thinking about how all these what I call systems work together. So if you start out with the big picture of your project or product and the different things to test and how they interact with each other, that would be really useful. What we have found useful recently is, if you like, exploratory testing early on in a project, to find out that horrible Donald Rumsfeld quote: "Unknown unknowns and known unknowns," if you like. So in a project we were on, we knew we had a problem with getting access to native iOS speech recognition with our systems. So we set out an exploratory phase at the beginning to test out different options, because we knew if we left that particular bit of testing until well into the project, it would be too difficult to reverse back out and go in again. So in a way, and I guess this is where that theory of change stuff might be useful. If you've got an idea of the weak spots in your project, things that you might be a bit anxious about, try and test them early on. It makes a lot of sense. And people tend to put off problems. I'll do that later, when I come to it. But actually doing it up front, it can save you a lot of grief later on. Yeah, so that is sometimes called an explore stage or a define stage. Or a prototyping stage. And then again, I keep coming back to this systems approach, because many times I've worked on projects where there's been no systems approach. And there's a quote attributed to, I think, Freud, the psychologist: everything's connected to everything. And a lot of people who are involved in ed tech or software, they just don't want to admit that. We'd like to have things in nice little tidy boxes. So try to test the big picture things and how they connect with each other. That would be my tip.
That's great. That's great. It's really interesting. Rachel, any thoughts from you on that?
Well, I agree with both Rachel and John. Very interesting points there. That diagram is gold dust. Everybody needs to have a copy of that. One thing that was very interesting that John said was about tackling those problems, tackling the things we really don't want to test. I mean, that is so important, because if you leave it and just hope it falls project somehow, it's not going to. It's still going to be a problem at the end, even as much as it was at the beginning. So get the sticky stuff done first. That is the horrible stuff. Get that prototyped out at the beginning. It will save you heartache and pain later, for sure. One thing that I don't think we've mentioned very much already, and I just wanted to leave people with, was this idea of recruiting your users, learners. It's okay to reuse, because you might only have a small set of people who volunteered to kind of take part in your testing. It's okay to reuse them, but be careful. Don't get them to do the same thing over and over again. mix it up a bit. You know, John was saying about having different systems, like integrating with each other. Plan your testing well and kind of give learner A section B to test, and kind of like mix it up along the way. It's okay to reuse people, but you know, just be careful that you don't confirm the stuff that they told you at the very beginning. It's very easy to get the answers that you want out of people. It's very easy to just confirm what you wanted to hear. So that would, just think about recruitment and how you can mix that up a little bit. And I have nothing else to add on that.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think there's some really hard-won advice there. So I'm now going to move on to my very last and final question to you, which is to all of you, and which is that this challenge is all about improving learner confidence and motivation to learn new vocational skills. But how can you test whether a project actually does this? What would be your advice on testing for confidence? And if you can keep this quite short, because we've got a question in from the audience. So it's going to start off testing for confidence. Rachel Smith, a quick bit of advice on how do you test for confidence?
The approach I would probably take is taking a control group, like getting some confidence, how people, really having a good understanding about how people are at the moment, how confident they are doing their learning, and then redo the test, the research at the end as well, or throughout, just to make sure that confidence is building and you get some good feedback. It would be a mixture of surveys and interviews. That's the way that I would probably approach it.
Great. John, what are your thoughts on how do you approach testing for confidence and whether something is making someone more confident?
Yeah. Well, coming back to the theory of change again, that was in our theory of change. That's the end state you want to get at. And I suppose the more clearly you can specify what signifies confidence in a particular situation, particular person, the easier you are going to be able to identify it. So I think that's the key. To measure confidence, first of all, you have to be very clear what constitutes confidence in a particular context by a particular person. And the more clearly you can identify that, the easier you can measure it. That sounds incredibly simple, but it's not. So for some of our learners, they couldn't fill in a questionnaire, but we did have questions to ask them, and we recorded the response. It's like a structured interview, basically, and observation and analytics. If they are doing stuff that they weren't doing before, and we can actually get the quants on that, that's a big sign. So actually, in our app that we've been making, we've got lots of measures of activity which can imply a growth of confidence as well. But I suppose that's the other thing. If you use technology to measure confidence, be careful, because it's an implication. You're implying that it equals confidence. So again, the more you can specify how that does equal confidence, like the narrative, if you like, of that confidence, that's important as well.
Thanks, that's really useful. And finally, Rachel Simnett, how would you go about testing whether something's actually improving someone's confidence?
Yes, well, I really don't have anything to add to those two answers, because I was going to say pretty much what's been said. I think the signifiers of confidence is a really crucial point. And in the past I've used, there are different scales, aren't there, that you can use, around just comprehension, and then being able to apply something, being able to explain it to somebody, being able to teach it to somebody, and those could be marks of increased confidence. But I've had my fingers burnt a bit with with those, actually very recently working with the London Council, where we relied rather too much on people's own view of their own confidence in certain areas. And there were some people who we knew were really not very competent at all in a particular skill area, because they'd actually been responsible for like major problems and major things going wrong. And when we ran a workshop and asked about their confidence levels, they were all marking themselves at 5, which was ability to teach it to somebody else. And I wouldn't let them anywhere near someone else to teach it. So I think sometimes the learning culture, if I can call it that, in an organisation comes into play. At this place, if you were a line manager or anybody in any kind of senior position, you could not admit that you didn't know something. So basically, all those people mark themselves and rate themselves very highly. So it does come down to other quantifiable measures, and it comes down to observation, absolutely. And particularly with the harder to reach people, the less confident learners, I think there are lots of ways other than expecting them to express themselves that you can find out how confident they are and whether that is increasing through observation and other metrics about how they're doing a job.
Thanks very much. Yes, it is difficult to get. It can be very difficult to get people to admit that they're not confident in something. Finally, we've got a question from the audience, which, if you look in the chat stream, is from Ahmed Chikatai, and Ahmed's asking. One of our observations has been that there's barely enough budget to finance the build, and for that reason, user research and testing often gets the chop. What do you feel is the best way of raising awareness of this with commissioning managers so they recognise the importance of user research and testing? Who'd like to tackle that one? Don?
Yeah, I would say that it's fairly well evidenced out there. You can find lots of examples where user research has actually saved money because it means that you're not building something that's rubbish and nobody's going to use. So there's lots of examples out there of where it does have a good return on investment. Investing time and energy, testing with your users, researching your users, pays a lot of dividends later. And there's lots of, I'll try and find some examples, but there's lots of stuff out there that I think Nielsen Norman, that website, it's got a great section on return on investment there.
I'll just add a little bit. It's I would say to the public sector commissioners that one of the biggest sources of failures is the lack of user research, and that it needs to be done. And you could also involve them by saying, what is your understanding of the needs of the users and the user situation? That way they start to take responsibility for a potential failure. So if you get that in your narrative to them, that might ease the purse strings a little bit.
Thanks, that's great. And I'm afraid all we have time for. That's been absolutely fantastic. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thanks for our panel for some excellent insights. We'll send you updates on the fund via the UFI community newsletter, which you signed up to when you registered for this workshop. And you can also follow us on social media. There's an email will be sent out to you, which include a link to the video of this discussion. There's one more Explore workshop running on learning design on the 21st. So there's a link on our main challenge page on the website to sign up. And if you want to send us any questions in advance, stick them to info@ufi.co.uk. We really hope you find the workshop useful. If you could take a few minutes to provide us with some feedback, that would be appreciated. A link to the survey has been dropped into the chat. And finally, I'd really like to thank everyone for taking part. So thanks so much to Rachel Simnett, John Casey, and Rachel Smith. Thank you all. And thank you to the audience. And we look forward to seeing you at our final Explore workshop on Wednesday, the 21st. Okay, goodbye.